Well, hi everyone. It's good to see you. This is Dennis Pethers, and going live now with teaching of my new book. Sounds a bit grand because I haven't finished the book yet, but teaching through my new book, which is called Discipleship. And as you can see, the strapline is as doing discipleship as Jesus intended. Hey, Sarah from Cincinnati. I haven't been there for a while. I need to get back there sometime, but it's good to see you. And anybody else that comes on, please say hi. It really helps me when people say hello because I know who's on the call. And I love to see that on every other call we have people all across the world. It's great to see people from different parts of the world just really thinking about how do we be disciples who make disciples. So just for a minute or two, I'll just welcome a few people. Nestor from Burundi is on. I see him. And I hope his son's with him so he can understand what I'm saying. Je parle un peu de français pour vous. Nestor, je parlerai, I should say, un peu de français. But it's good to see you guys coming on. And we're going through this book just to explain if anyone's joining that hasn't been on before, because some weeks we have new people on. I'm writing this book called Discipleship, which is not a spelling mistake. It's meant to be called Discipleship, not Discipleship. And the reason for it is, as I've had the opportunity to travel many places and seen the church in action in so many different contexts, the one thing I think that often is lacking, well, there are two things. One thing that's often lacking tragically is a real passion for the people outside. And that's where the rooftop, the ministry that I lead, came from, that to reignite that passion, that we would be passionate about the people that Jesus came to seek and to save. But also what I see as a common theme in many churches that I've worked with in many parts of the world is that they haven't really got a strategy for making disciples who make disciples. In fact, when they even talk about discipleship, what they seem to mean by it is more turning people into good church members rather than equipping them to shine light into dark places and make disciples among the people outside the walls of the church. That's what the book's all about. It's called Discipleship, and what it's about is that, and we're now up to chapter 7. We've covered 6 chapters, the first 2 sections of the book, and in the beginning of it, we looked at the purpose of discipleship. Then we began to think about the cost of it and how do we numerically grow the number of people that are disciples. And then in this session, we're starting a new section, which is all about the process of discipleship, and that's what we're going to be thinking about. What is the process that we need to follow if we're really going to see the church becoming a movement of people who are disciples becoming disciples? So that's what we're doing. And as I've said, every week I've come on and done this. The book's not finished yet. So this isn't just a me teaching session, really. It's more of me sharing what I'm thinking so far, what I've written so far, and here it is. Look, see. But then asking you to comment on what you hear me say, because I want to hear your comments. I want to make sure that I'm not saying things in ways that are unhelpful. I don't want to cause any unnecessary offense. But on the other hand, I don't want to say things that are not helpful just by being too soft. I want to get the balance right, because what this book, Discipleship, is dealing with is some quite important issues. The mission of Jesus is so important. He came from heaven to seek and to save what was lost. There can't be anything more important than that. And if we're going to join him in that mission, then it's so key that we get it right in the way that he wants us to get it right. Not because getting it right saves us, because Jesus saves us. It's not, we don't earn anything. But the mission is so important that getting it right is so critical, because it's for the sake of the people of this world that Jesus came. So that's what the whole thing is about. So please, as we go through, if you have any comments or thoughts or anything, just write them down in the comments. I can see them. Dave, who you can't see, he's in the background making me look reasonably competent. He records all of this, and at the end of it, I get a copy of everything I've said, but I also get copies of your questions and comments that you write down in the comment section. So please write anything down that occurs to you. If you think I could say something better, or you think I shouldn't be saying it at all, or you think there's something I'm not saying, then just write it there. I can't promise that I'll react and do everything that you say, because at the end of the day, I have to make decisions about what I'm going to put into the book. But it really is helpful to me. So yeah, if you're coming on, if anyone's just joining, do say hello, so I know you're there. And we're gonna get cracking in just a minute. Say hello to me if you've just joined in. And so this is chapter 7. and it's a part of it's the start of a new section, which is all about the process of discipleship. So let me begin. And as I always say, I'll be reading some of this because it is a book. So as I'm writing a book, I have to read the script sometimes to get it just right. Not all the time, but that's what I'll be doing most of the time. So this is chapter 7, and the title of this chapter is Learning by Doing. Learning and Doing. Learning and Doing. That's what we're going to be thinking about. So here we go. A while ago, I was spending some time with my good friends Marion and Vicky Spencer in Tennessee. And one day, Marion asked if I'd like to go play golf with him. I said to him that I'd not hit a golf ball for over 30 years, and even then, I didn't hit it very well. I prefer to hit a ball that is moving because tennis is the game I love to play. However, a few hours later, I found myself on a golf course with Marion. We were on the first tee, and Marion came over to me, and he stood next to me as I was holding the driver, and he said to me, "It would be a good idea if you changed the grip a little. And also, while you're doing that, it would be good if you stood a little differently as well." And this was the beginning of an interesting couple of hours, as with almost every shot I attempted, Marion was giving me advice. And when my shot, and I'm being kind to myself by saying shot, went sideways or just sped along the fairway or rough for a few yards, he then explained to me what I'd done wrong. And as we were going through this, I said to Marion, "Do you realize that you're discipling me?" "How come?" he replied. I continued, "You're helping me bit by bit to learn how to become better at playing golf." The really amusing end to the story was that on the last hole, I hit the longest drive of the whole day. I think it was about as long as Marion's, which is a long way. I'd like to say this was because I'd become a great golfer, but it was more due to the fact that the first bounce of my ball was on the concrete path, and it continued to bounce along the path, gaining pace after every bounce. So that's how I made this long shot. I'll be honest with you, for me, playing golf is something I find very difficult. And if I were ever to play at a level where I would be prepared to say I am a golfer, I would need an enormous amount of practice and guidance. Might improve a little if I did it alone, but I'd never reach the place where I would consider myself a golfer. I'd need practice and guidance. Now, being a follower of Jesus and joining him in his mission is huge. In fact, it's impossible for any person to do alone. Being a follower of Jesus is much more difficult than learning to play golf. To live a life that reveals Jesus to the world is an enormous challenge, as we live in a world where there's so much temptation, distraction, and sometimes opposition, and probably many other things as well. And the combination of all these things is it makes it much easier for us to live lives that conceal Jesus rather than reveal Jesus. So much easier. And Jesus was aware of this. He knew it would be difficult to follow him. It was difficult being him, and he knew to follow him his way would be difficult. And so he focused on making disciples who will be able to make disciples. And Jesus knew that a simple decision just to follow him would never be enough for a person to actively participate in joining him in his mission. As such, Jesus had a process that he used to ensure that those who followed him would be able to accomplish what he wanted them to do. And we're going to come back to that a little bit later on. But just let me say this as a way of introduction to this. It's tempting to divide life into categories and think, for example, that following Jesus is a spiritual part of my life that is different from the physical or practical part of my life. Now, Jesus that's the spiritual side. And it is clear in the way that Jesus made his disciples that the spiritual and the practical were really closely connected. Or to put it another way, the why, the what, and the how we live and behave as followers of Jesus are all connected together. And to join Jesus in his mission requires that there's something we have to do that is both spiritual and practical. So in the first half of the book, we considered the purpose and cost of being a disciple or a follower of Jesus. In many ways, that's the what and the why. I want to focus in this chapter and the chapters following on the how. And that's why I've called the book Discipleship, because being a disciple is a holistic, not just spiritual or just practical thing. It's both together and it involves all of our lives. So it's clear that there is a spiritual dimension to being an effective disciple. Jesus said, "You will receive power," this is Acts 1:8, "when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in all Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. So clearly, Jesus said there is a spiritual dynamic that is required. We can't do this alone. However much effort and energy we put into it, if we try to join his mission alone, we will never do it. There is an absolutely crucial, critical Holy Spirit power that we need to be effective followers of Jesus. But he also said, therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. So that, to me, as I look at those things, I see the combination that is required for us to really be able to learn from Jesus and become disciples who make disciples is we need a combination of power and process. We need the two together. There are some Christians that they have no idea of process. It's just all power, power, power. And they want to see God keep doing great and supernatural things. And God can and will do those things. But there are other Christian people who just, well, we just follow what we do week by week, week by week. And there is no expectation of power. As I look at it, we need both of these. We need the power of God at work in us, changing us and through us changing the world. But also we need a process that we follow, which in a sense is a more natural process. It's supernatural power, but a natural process. And by natural process, what I mean is this. I don't mean unsuper, but I do believe that God has put into place ways of learning that all of us actually have to go through if we're really going to learn how to do things. There's a natural process of learning that we have to go through. And I think that it's so important as we think about that we recognize as part of that natural process of learning that doing things is absolutely critical and can't be put on one side and seen as an optional extra. Let me give a few examples of what I mean by that. It's not just golf that I've been learning recently, although I didn't learn a great deal at golf, I have to be honest, even despite Marion's attempts to disciple me. But because of the ministry I lead, the Rooftop, I get the opportunity to travel to many countries around the world and many in Latin America, where mostly the people speak Spanish. And as a result, I'm now learning to speak Spanish. If you'd have asked me 2 years ago, can you speak Spanish? I would have said no. But I now realize, and please listen to this part, I now realize that saying no wouldn't mean that I'm incapable of speaking Spanish, just that I'd never learned how to. Do you see the difference between those two things? No, I can't speak Spanish meant I wasn't learning to speak Spanish. It didn't mean I was incapable of speaking Spanish. So now it's different. So now I'm learning Spanish. I read articles in Spanish. I've downloaded a popular app. And as often as I can, I engage in conversation with people in Spanish. And what I find is the more Spanish I speak with people that speak Spanish, I improve slowly, but I realize also I get lots of things wrong. But the great thing about this is when I realize there's a better way to say it than I thought, and I learn a new way of getting it across the right way, I get really excited. Because I know that even though I've got a long way to go, I am learning Spanish. So when a person asks me now the question, can you speak Spanish? My answer isn't no. My answer is yes. A little, and I'm learning to speak it better. See, I was never incapable of learning Spanish. I just wasn't doing it. And it's as I'm doing it that I'm realizing that I can. And there are so many things that we if we think about it, that is true of most of our lives. So I just wrote a few things down here. So for example, many years ago, I learned how to drive. When I began work in the City of London, I learned how to handle claims in the insurance industry. As a young boy, I began to learn how to play tennis and other sports. And while these very simple examples are very different from each other, and you'd have your own examples of these, the one thing that has been common in everything that I've learned is that I've had to do it to learn it. There's nothing that I can do that I can say describes me that I haven't actually had to do to say I am I would have said a claim settler at Lloyd's, a driver of a car, a tennis player, whatever. Everything which I say I'm competent at is because I've had to do it. Does that make sense? You got any questions about that? Please feel free to ask or make any comments you want, because I welcome those. And if you're just joining, please say hello. Let me know you're there. I can see a few people are on. But if there's anybody else that's joined since we began, just let me know you're there. Just say hello to me, and it's encouraging for me to know that. You see, the reason I'm underlining how important it is that we do things is that following Jesus, becoming a disciple who makes disciples, is something which is not easy. It's not a simple thing to do. And that's why a lot of us actually prefer to not be a real follower of Jesus, but just, in a sense, go to church and join in with church stuff. In fact, Jesus said this in Matthew 7:13 and 14. He said, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction. Many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." And I think what he's saying there is that if we choose to follow Jesus, we're not choosing the easy path. We're not choosing the simple road. We're actually choosing a road which it's inherently difficult, because it's about living in a way which is going to be honoring to God and actually shining light into places which often are dark. And as the word of God says, people prefer darkness to light quite often. But because Jesus knew it was so difficult, and it would be impossible for them to follow his commands and join him in his mission if it was left to them, he didn't just leave them. He didn't leave it up to them, He equipped them to ensure that they wouldn't fall away and that they would therefore fail to join him in his mission. And so what I want to look at for the rest of this chapter is I want to look at really the way that learning takes place and the way that Jesus went about it. So as we think about that, let's begin by asking this question. Where does learning take place? What is the best context for learning? Where does learning take place? And I've written this little line, which I think is a me line. I've written this. So if you think this is a good quote, tell me. If you think it's a terrible quote, tell me. But I put this: the context in which learning takes place is a hugely determining factor on the amount of true learning that is experienced. That's a Pethers quote. What do you think? Let me say it again. The context in which learning takes place is a hugely determining factor on the amount of true learning that is experienced. So what do I mean by that is this: if doing is such an important part of learning, where we learn is a really important part of learning. And the way I want to answer is, I think the way where we learn best is by doing on the job. That's a phrase we use in England quite a lot. On the job. We have to be on the job. We have to be in a place of learning which is actually going to involve us being actively engaged in doing things. You see, when Jesus said he'll make his disciples fishers of men or fishers of people, the context, the place that he equipped them in wasn't behind the walls of a building, but it was out in public places. The place, the context where the learning took place, the place of it was where the people were. It was in the public places he taught them how they should live and how they should make and be his disciples. And let me just underline that. If you look at the Gospels, for example, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and if you read them through quickly, you see a multiple list of places where Jesus ministered and he was accompanied by his disciples. See, their learning context was not a worship center. It wasn't a lecture room. It wasn't a fellowship hall. It was among the people that Jesus came to seek and to save. So I've just taken a few verses from the first few chapters of Mark's Gospel. You could do this in any Gospel, and you could find a lot more than I found. This just took me a couple of minutes to do. Mark 1, chapter 21. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. So the synagogue. Mark 1:29. As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. The evening after sunset, Mark 1:32 to 34. The evening after the sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, it says, gathered at the door. and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. Jesus replied in Mark 1:38, let us go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so I can preach there also. That's why I've come. Mark 2:13, once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him and he began to teach them. Mark 2:15, while Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. Mark 2:23, one Sabbath Jesus was going through the grain fields and his disciples walked along. They began to pick up some heads of grain. Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the lake. Mark 3:7. Mark 3:20, then Jesus entered a house and again a crowd gathered. Mark 5:1-2. Mark 5:1-2. They went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. Mark 6:1. They left there and went to his hometown, accompanied by his disciples. So that's just a very quick scan of just the different places where Jesus ministered. And as you can see, and we know anyway, that in all of those different places, the synagogue, the homes, villages, the lake, the grain fields, all these different places that are listed very quickly from how Jesus did his ministry, this is where the disciples learned how to be disciples. The place where it takes place. You can't learn how to be a disciple who makes disciples unless you're among people doing it. You can't learn it in a worship center or a fellowship hall or some other room in the church. You have to be doing it. That's the key. The context in which it happens really is essential for the learning that's going to take place. Any questions about that? I see, Sarah, you raised a question on that. And if you want to come back with another one, please do. Anyone else that's got one, because this is so important. And if you can help me to say this more clearly, I would really appreciate it. Where we learn is absolutely critical for how we learn. You can't learn to do things if you're not actually in the place of doing them, so that you're learning from what you're doing. I didn't say that very well, did I? You know what I mean? And you see the reason for that. The reason Jesus ensured that he made his disciples on the job among the people, where the people were, is because he knew that for true learning to take place, there has to be what I call active engagement. You have to actively engage with people. So he didn't, I've said this already, but I'm going to underline it. He didn't leave his disciples behind in a building while he went to engage in ministry and then come back and tell them what happened. They went with him. They were with him throughout, and they actively engaged with individuals and crowds that Jesus engaged with. They were there all the time, and that is how they learned. We'll come back to this a bit later on, but by contrast, most church learning takes place in the context of passive disengagement. So Jesus equipped his disciples in the context of active engagement. Most church equipping or teaching or whatever takes place in the context of passive. That's not active, but passive. We sit, we receive disengagement, not among people. Where behind the walls of a building, those who are being taught sit, often in the same place week after week, and listen to sermon after sermon, but have no opportunity to put into practice what they're hearing. And ultimately, they become an audience who like to hear good sermons, but are not really learning how to be disciples. They're gaining a lot of information, but there's not a great deal of transformation. Add to that, it's true that many Christians also, they're part of small groups. They might call them home groups or life groups or something, and some Sunday school groups or whatever. And they offer a different dynamic to a large gathering, but more often than not, even in these smaller gatherings, most of the learning is still largely passive and disengaged. And so, essentially, I remember when I first became a Christian and went to church. I come, as many of you know, from a completely not church background. I could never understand how the way that the disciples learned from Jesus was so different from the ways that people learned in church. I could never work out why Jesus did it the way he did it, and the church seemed to do it so differently. How everybody just gathered in a place every Sunday or whatever, just going through the same thing. And it was never applied to the situations that people found themselves in. And so as I reflect on that, and I'm going to go a bit deeper in a moment into how Jesus did it, but as I reflect on that, I think something which I will include in the book, this is still something I'm thinking about a little bit how I include it, but I want to say it here to get any comments that you might have. But I think one of the great challenges for many, many churches, this isn't true for every denomination, but for many, many churches, is that the way that we do church is based upon a model of church, which is largely impacted by what was called the Reformation of the church centuries ago, where we began to be church and do church in a certain way, which primarily was focused around a time of worship in some way, and then but the center of it all was the preaching, where a pastor would preach from a pulpit to a congregation. And the challenge of that is that since the time of the Reformation, when the Reformation took place, and the world in which we live today, there's quite a lot of difference. Let me just highlight a few things that I think are really important as we think about that. The first one is this. The Reformation took place at a time when the vast majority of people in what was called Christendom at the time, Christian nations, most people were regularly in church. So the Reformation wasn't a missional movement, it was a reforming movement. It was actually changing what happened in the church to make it more what they felt should be taking place in a time of worship. So that's why it's called the Reformation, because it was reforming things, coming together to be church, but doing things in a different way, a different form to how they were done before. But another thing which I think is really important is that at the time of the Reformation, many of the people that went to church and listened to sermons, they were largely illiterate and often not well educated, which meant they couldn't read the Bible themselves. So they needed to have someone to read the scriptures out loud to them and somebody to teach them. Now, this is still the case in some parts of the world, but in many parts of the world, the vast number of people are completely illiterate and very well educated. So they don't need somebody to do it for them. They actually have the ability to do it themselves. It doesn't mean they can't be helped by somebody to give them a deeper understanding of it. But what I'm saying is that these people are capable of reading, understanding, learning, and applying the Bible. They just need to be helped to do it, not have somebody do it for them or to them. And the challenge, I think, of that, the reformed kind of model of the church, is it creates a context of being church where there's one communicator and everybody else are listeners. It's often kind of like an audience where everything happens on the platform, on the stage, and there's very little participation and implementation of what is heard, which leads to this passive learning context. And I don't say no, but very little true learning takes place because it's not being put into practice. It's just happening in a context. See, where it's happening, as I was saying before, the context in which we learn has a huge impact on what we truly learn. If we learn discipleship and disciple making among the people, we really learn. If we learn it or are taught it in a context where we're disengaged and passively listening, we just have to ask the question, how much are we really learning? We might be gaining lots of information, but how much transformation is taking place? How much is it impacting what we do and the behavior and the extent to which we truly join Jesus' mission? Please ask any questions you have or make any comments you have on this, because this is such an important part of this whole book that I really would appreciate any thoughts you have about this. So what that means is, if we're going to really be a movement that is making disciples that make disciples, I think the challenge is, and I don't say this to be difficult, I just say it because I think it's such an important thing to think about, is that what we've got to do, we've got to be willing to continue to let the church be reforming, because I think we need a form of being church now in the days in which we live, which are far more missional, and where people aren't just going to come to church because it's what their parents or their grandparents did, which is the case in some countries. The reality is now we live in a mission field, and for us to engage that mission field, we need to be doing church in a reforming pattern where at the core of everything is equipping people to be able to join Jesus in his mission. So on that basis, let me just ask a few questions and now really get into how Jesus went about it. But before we get to Jesus, let me mention somebody else who's very well known. His name's Confucius. And Confucius said this. So the question I'm asking now is, how does learning take place? How do we really learn? And Confucius said this: I hear and I forget. I see and I remember. I do and I understand. Let me just read that again. Confucius said, I hear and I forget. I see and I remember. I do and I understand. Now, I think these words are a helpful observation of the true principles of learning. But at the same time, I think taken on face value, they can easily be misunderstood. The misunderstanding comes if the three statements are viewed in isolation. Because in that case, the first one, I hear and I forget, isn't actually a true statement. Whilst it's true that most people forget most of what they hear, there are a lot of things, a variety of things that make the spoken word very memorable. But I think the real point of the statement isn't that each of these three components of, let me just read this. I think the real point of the statement is that each of these three components are vital for learning to take place. And that one of them alone, the hearing one alone, is not enough. If we just hear words, that's not enough for us to truly learn. They have to be connected. What we hear, what we see, and what we do have to be joined together. They're not separate things, they're joined. So therefore, there is a need for words, but if it's only words, it's not enough. And I think the implications of this being true are absolutely revolutionary in the way that people learn, but more importantly, in the way that we be and do church. So let's just have a look at these for a moment. He said, I hear and I forget. So let me just ask you to think about that. How true is that in your own experience? You can't answer it precisely, but as a rough guide, how many of the sermons that you've heard in your life can you remember? And how long do you typically remember them for? And what are the things that you do remember? And if possible, can you point to what it is that makes these parts memorable? Why do you remember some sermons a lot more than others? What is it that makes you remember them? If you remember them. I know I found myself a number of times saying to people, what did the preacher preach on Sunday? And they go, Jesus, which is a pretty safe bet, hopefully, in most churches. But the truth is, I found in my experience, many Christians would say that they find it very difficult to remember what was preached on even the same day. I'm not here to criticize preaching. I preach in churches regularly. And my sermons get forgotten just as much as anybody else's. So I'm not here to pick at anybody or devalue their ministry at all. Nothing like that. I'm just looking at really honestly and openly, how do we learn? And the reality is that hearing alone, for most people, well, they forget it. So in my experience, talking to many people I've discovered many Christians remember very, very little for very long about what they've heard. And that supports the comment, I hear, I forget. It's not something we should beat ourselves up about. But it's also not only true in the context of Christian gatherings, by the way. It's not just Christian. This is true of all contexts. It's not only Christians who hear things and then forget. And what causes us to remember what we heard primarily is when what we heard is in the context of the wider learning experience. So we learn what we're told if we begin to do something with what we're told. Any comments on that, please? If you have any, I'd appreciate them. So the next thing that Confucius said was, I see and I remember. And there's a proverb you may know which says this: a picture is worth or paints. It's often said both ways. A picture is worth or paints 1,000 words. And visual things are very important in helping people to remember, or to grab people's attention, so that they get the point so powerfully made that they never forget it. And the proverb, I guess, demonstrates that often complex and multiple ideas that take many words to explain can often be more effectively presented by the use of just one image. And you can probably think of stories or things that you've seen on the television or in newspapers, whatever, where an image has been so powerful that you get it, you understand it just because of that image. And that's really true. But I think it's more than that. I think the image, seeing, I see, seeing is that the impact of an image can be so strong. But I think there's a whole other area of it as well, which well, let me say this. I didn't notice this, but let me just go back to this. I think as well as seeing an image, words can create images in people's minds. So there is a relationship between what we hear and what we see. And Jesus was a master at that. He realized that the most important way for people to see truth by what you said was by using story, for example. He used stories over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. Because he realized that if you can create pictures in people's minds so they see what you're saying, that makes it more memorable. But as well as that, it's not just seeing so that you remember. It's also seeing something being done so that you learn more by watching it than you do just by hearing it. So let me give you some very practical examples of what I mean by that. A number of years ago, I have, because I travel, I have these noise reduction headphones that I use. And a number of years ago, they stopped working. And I couldn't work out what was wrong. So I went online and Googled my headphones not working. And I came across all these different sites that had all these long explanations. I read through what they were saying. I couldn't make head nor tail of any of them. So then I had another idea. I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll use a popular video site, which you will have heard of. So I went there and I put the same thing in, and I found myself with a selection of videos I could look at. And in the selection of videos I could look at, there were a number of them which had a guy sitting there with my headphones in his hand, explaining exactly what was wrong. And then what he did was he actually fixed them, showed you how to fix them. And I watched him. As I watched him do it, I picked up my headphones. They were exactly the same as his. I held them in my hands like he was. And what I saw him doing, I did with my headphones. And after about 30 seconds, they were working. So seeing is, yes, it does help to remember, but seeing somebody do something is a huge help for you to begin to gain the confidence. I think Confucius said, I see, I remember. I think I see and I feel confidence, or I see and I begin to see how is something which is more than what he said. Because when we see something being performed in front of our eyes, it gives us a greater sense of confidence that we can do this because we're watching it happen. And what I'm holding looks the same as what he's holding. He's doing this, I'll do it too, and it will happen. It's interesting, Paul, when he wrote to the church at Corinth, a church that was, it was filled with all kinds of issues about stuff that wasn't really as it should be. But to this church, Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 4 and 16, "Therefore, I urge you to imitate me." He wanted them to get what it meant to be a real follower of Jesus. And he said, imitate me. And then a bit later on in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 1, he says, "Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ." And really what he's saying is live like you see me living. And I think, how do we learn to be a disciple that makes disciples? Well, there's hearing, part of it, but in terms of the seeing, I think a hugely important part of that is by having the opportunity to watch other people be that, so that as we see them doing it. Let me give you an example. Years ago, I was starting out in evangelism. This was a long time ago. But I contacted some different evangelists and said, can you help me? I have no idea how to do this. What do I do? And most of them, to be honest, weren't particularly interested in helping a young guy starting out. But one was, his name was Vic. And for a number of years, I traveled with Vic Jacobson. And we went to different parts of the world. And I watched him and I watched him and I watched him. And as I watched him over and over again, at first I made a mistake because I watched Vic do things. And then when I wasn't with Vic, I tried to do things that I saw Vic do, and they didn't work because I wasn't Vic. And gradually what I realized is that watching and learning by watching somebody isn't always just copying exactly what they do. It is if you're fixing your headphones, I guess. But when it's about how do you follow Jesus and you watch somebody else doing it, what I began to learn was that I don't have to be Vic Jacobson to follow Jesus. I have to learn from Vic Jacobson's way of following Jesus and apply that to Dennis Pethers so I could follow Jesus in the Dennis Pethers way. Because another example, there's another guy I used to work with years ago. His name's Steve Chalk. And long time ago, he and I were both speaking at a youth weekend. That shows how long ago it was. And I led the first session. And then Steve led the second. And as I was really just very young and very fresh at doing all of this back then. And when I watched what Steve was doing, I thought, man, the people, they're laughing at Steve more than they laughed at me. And man, he's so good. So in the third session, which I did, I tried to be like Steve. I thought I'll tell more jokes and make it more funny and everything else. But my great learning experience from that was when one of the young people said to me after the third session, this is what he said to me, I'll never forget this. He said to me, I thought you were much better when you were just being yourself. Man, that was such a learning experience. You were much better when you were just being yourself. I don't remember the boy's name. I can't even remember what he looked like. But what I learned from him became a key ingredient of a learning process for me that's continued for the rest of my life. That I don't have to be somebody else. So what am I saying here? That we learn by watching people so much, but that doesn't mean that we have to copy them and become them. What we have to do is learn from them and say, what does that mean for me? How do I apply that to my life and my situation? And then the final thing that Confucius says is, I do and I understand. And it wasn't just Confucius that said that. Jesus said in Matthew 7:24 through 29, therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And you know the rest of it. The winds blow and everything. I won't read it all now because of time. And the crowds were amazed at what Jesus said. But let me just quickly talk you through something as we draw towards the end of this session. I want to look at how Jesus really used a method which I think we have to rediscover if we're going to really be about joining him in his mission. And the method that he used is quite similar in some ways to what Confucius said. It's actually a very similar method to what he talked about. Confucius said, I hear, I forget, I see, I remember, I do, and I understand. Jesus' method, I've simplified. I call it the tell me, show me, let me method. Let me explain what I mean. I think as Jesus made his disciples, he did those three things. Firstly, he told them to tell me. And what he did, and you can read all of this in the Gospels, it's all there very, very clearly. Over and over again, Jesus repeatedly told his disciples the truths about the kingdom. He quoted scripture, he used monologue, he used dialogue, he told stories, he told parables. Over and over again, Jesus was telling. He was telling constantly. He was telling his disciples. But he knew that the telling on its own wouldn't be enough. He knew he couldn't just sit them down in a lecture theatre or a worship centre or, as I was saying before, a fellowship centre or whatever. He knew he couldn't just sit them down in a place and just tell them. But he did need to tell them. So the telling is a really important part of Jesus' approach to helping his disciples learn how to be disciples. He said lots of things over and over again. And I think sometimes people have said, how come is it that in this gospel, Jesus says this here, and in that gospel, he says it somewhere else? And I think the answer to that is he probably said it more than once. I think Jesus repeated lots of the things that he said over and over again, because he knew that most of us pick things up very slowly. Most of us need to be told things lots and lots of times. So the telling is important. But also, the next point is show me. He showed the disciples how to live and to reveal the kingdom. As we began to look at earlier on where it took place, the where of learning, they were with Jesus when he healed the sick. They were with him when he raised the dead. They were with him when he spoke about the kingdom. They were with him when he handled opposition. They were with him when he went to be with sinners. They were with him, watching him. A little bit like, in some ways, I guess, I was watching Vic and watching Steve. They were watching him. They saw him do these things. And as they were part of this small learning team, or I often call it learning community, that was bringing the kingdom near, they were doing that whilst they were watching him do it. And so for Jesus, the seeing part is the showing part. He showed them how to do it. And sometimes when they watched, they were filled with awe, they felt overwhelmed, they felt amazed, they were confused, and they were curious. But slowly, by watching him do it and then asking questions about how and what and where and so on, they began to slowly understand some more of what Jesus was doing. But for them to fully understand it, or I'm not even sure they ever did fully understand it, but for them to understand it much more fully, listening to what Jesus said and watching him do it could only achieve so much. To really learn what they had to, Jesus knew that he had to let them do it themselves. So that's the third point. Let me. Tell me, show me, let me. And the way Jesus let them was he sent them out. And we read in Luke chapter 9, verses 1 through 6. I'll just read the first part of it, but it'll all be in the book. When Jesus called the 12 together, he gave them power and authority to drive out all demons and to cure diseases. He sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. So he sent them, go and do it. You've watched me, now go. What you've seen me do, the things he told them to do, were in his power with his authority to drive out demons, to cure diseases, the things they'd seen him do. You've seen me do it, he said. Now you go do it. Go and do what you've seen me do. So he told them, he'd showed them, and now he let them do it. And then in Luke 10, verses 1 through 4, it's a bigger group, not just the 12 now, but a larger group of disciples. After this, the Lord appointed 72 others and sent them 2 by 2 ahead of him to every town and place he was about to go. And he told them the harvest is plentiful. And then he sends them too. And if you read Luke chapter 10, the first few verses, you'll see that they get sent to do the same thing. Go, I'm sending you out like lambs among wolves. That's a big challenge. So Jesus let them do it. And he knew that if he was going to entrust his mission to them, he couldn't just tell them about it and show them about it. He had to send them to learn how to do it. And then they would come back from these different exploits, or as it went on. And what would happen was they would realize that they couldn't always do what Jesus had told them to do. In Mark 9, verses 14 to 29, there's just one example of many, many stories that I could have chosen, which I'll use. But basically, it's a story of someone that comes to Jesus and says, can you heal me? Because your disciples couldn't do it. And that there's a whole conversation that takes place around that. And in the end, the disciples asked Jesus, why couldn't we drive out this evil spirit? Why couldn't we do it? And Jesus replied, this kind can only come out by prayer. Now, we could spend a lot of time looking at all of that, but I don't want to here. The point is they needed further instruction when they realized they couldn't do it. So Jesus had to say, well, no, this is how you do it. And that kind of thing is repeated over and over again. And often an absolutely critical part of learning is realizing that we don't know how to do it. We only find that we don't know how to do it when we try it and it doesn't work. And then we think, well, how does it work? And that's when we begin to learn. So I'm convinced that The method that Jesus used was in some way similar to Confucius' statement, because he recognized that for true learning to take place, the learner needs to be told, to be shown, and then to be given the opportunity to do it. And I'm also convinced that the greatest amount of learning takes place in the doing of what we've seen, what we've been told. And that's why true discipleship will always be DOscipleship, hence the title of this book. Because without the doing, we'll never learn how to join Jesus' mission, and we'll continue to be convinced that I can't do it. And what we really mean is I don't do it. A bit like what I was saying earlier with me speaking Spanish. I can't speak Spanish. Didn't mean I wasn't capable of doing it. It just meant I wasn't doing it. And when it comes to Christians saying I can't share my faith, I can't make disciples, they're saying exactly the same thing. Not that they're not capable of doing it, but they're not doing it. And they could become capable of doing it. How? If they did it. And they would get things wrong. And it's in the getting things wrong that we learn how to do it better and better and better. And therefore, I don't blame Christians, by the way, for thinking they can't do it. I don't think it's their fault largely. I think it's largely because most of them have never been equipped to be and make disciples. Because most of the learning they've experienced has been passive and disengaged learning, where they're constantly being told what they should do, but they're not being helped to do it. So therefore, they just conclude they can't do it. When Jesus said to his disciples, greater things than these will you do, that must have been a huge, huge challenge to them. So let me just say a few things at the close of this. I still will need to tidy this up a little bit. But let me just go here with some things I'd like to say at the end of this book, this chapter. First one is this. I think there is a need for reforming. I think the church needs to be and I think it is now, but I think it needs to accelerate a time of reforming. And the reason for that, I think, is because there are some foundational differences between Jesus' method and the church's method. I've hinted at these earlier, but let me just simplify them now. Number one, the church's primary method of teaching is restricted to telling. There's very little and often no examples of how to make disciples or opportunities to make them. There's very little showing and there's very little people being sent to do. But people turn up at church week after week after week and are told again and again and again and again and again, but they're not being shown how or given opportunities to do, largely. Which is why 98% of Christians never share their faith. And secondly, most teaching in the church takes place on a campus or in a home environment. These are safe zones where they're not, where they are is not among the people. And so real learning is not taking place because they're not doing. They're just receiving information. And so the reforming, the adjustment that needs to take place is firstly, and I could spend a long time on this, but I'll be brief. Firstly, we mustn't keep telling people what they should be doing unless we're equipping them to do it. So many people I know in church, they've been told hundreds and hundreds of times they should be. But that's it. It's just words. And so they don't feel they can do it. They don't do it. And then they convince themselves they can't do it and end up not ever doing it. They feel full of failure and guilt and they just can't do it. The second thing is this, and this is really important, I think, is we've got to recognize, and I'm going to look at this in the next chapter, but the church needs to have within its fellowship leaders, not just to preach to the people that come to church, but we need leaders who can equip Jesus followers to be able to make disciples when they're not at church. Our leadership needs to be much more about equipping the people to do the work. And we need leaders to do that. And as well as that, church needs to be a community which provides opportunities for followers of Jesus to be off campus making disciples who make disciples. Let me conclude by this. I find it really interesting, as well as looking at Confucius and Jesus. I also did I'm going to sneeze, I think. Excuse me, I'm sorry if that was right in your ear. That will not be in the book, by the way. I will erase that from the notes that Dave sends through to me. There will be no sneeze in the book. But just a few things I might include in this chapter, which as I look beyond Confucius and Jesus and just began to look at just the natural ways that people learn. And there are three things that I discovered. In fact, there were 300 things I discovered. There are three things that I thought were really important. One is this, and these are statements from educational theorists who just have looked at the whole learning experience in so many ways, and they go so deep. I've tried to simplify what they said, but here's one, and I'll finish with these three things. When passive learning is the dominant factor, productivity growth is invariably bounded. What that means is, if we're taught in a passive environment where there are no opportunities to put it into practice, there's never any growth. And in relation to disciple making, this is evidenced by the fact, as I said just a moment ago, that only 2% of Christians ever share their faith with a person outside of the church. The reason nearly every Christian never shares their faith is because their learning is taking place in a passive learning environment. And so therefore, they just listen to it, agree with it, don't do it. Second thing, which is really important, is too much passive learning leads to stagnation. In other words, as somebody once said, when all is said and done, there's a lot more said than there is done. And what happens is that people in church who have been to church for months, years and years of their lives, they become sermon tasters. They say, oh, thank you for that wonderful sermon. That's just what we needed. It was a great word. It really spoke to my heart, and so on and so on. All of that is good, but that's it. It doesn't lead anywhere. And after a while, what can so easily happen is that Christians just become used to deciding whether or not they like a preacher. And they think if they like the preacher, that was a good worship experience. If they don't like it, that's a bad worship experience. If the whole thing is centered there. But the fruit of it is not whether we enjoyed the sermon. The fruit of it is whether we go and make disciples. And if nearly all of our learning takes place in a passive environment, in the end, we become consumers of teaching rather than producers of disciples. And then the last thing, people need to learn how to, not just know that. So let me say that again. People need to learn how to, not just know that. And as one of the educational theorists put it, life requires us to do more than it requires us to know in order to function. In other words, and this supports everything I've said in this chapter so far, information is not the same as transformation. And if we're going to be disciples who make disciples who make disciples, if we're going to see the power of God work through us, we need a process of learning, which is all about us learning how to do by what we hear, by what we see, but then by being given opportunities to actually serve. So in the next chapter, what I want to be doing is exploring how the church can lead people. What kind of leaders do we need to create communities of people on mission with Jesus who are actually learning how to move from information to transformation? That'll be next time. But thanks for your comments. I've had a few. I haven't had as many comments today. Perhaps I was so clear you didn't need to do it. But if you've got any comments or thoughts, please put them quickly on the thing now, or send them by email to me, because I do want to hear your thoughts. I really do. Hope that was useful. I hope it wasn't too complicated. For me, it's very simple because I've been grappling with it for a long time. But if as you heard it, you thought, Dennis, what are you talking about? Then please get back to me and tell me that you need it simpler. And I'll try what I can to make it something you can really grasp. So thanks ever so much. I really, really appreciate your time. And I'll see you next Friday for chapter 8. God bless you. Bye.